Hey guys, what I wanted to do for you is kind of supplement what we've been talking about, and just kind of maybe fill in some gaps about the American Civil War. I found this PowerPoint. It follows a pretty good timeline on the internet, and I thought I'd just go through it with you. Like I said, to fill in some of the gaps. So the PowerPoint starts when it talks about the causes of the Civil War. Now, we've talked about um, different causes of the Civil War. Mainly, we've talked about slavery, but it also has to do North and the South fighting has to do with slave or states' rights, being that the North wanted to preserve the Union and the South wanted the freedom to choose slavery in their states. This was a big source of conflict from the time the United States became the United States to really right up until the Civil War. You can see there was big differences between the North and the South. The South was a very rural place, whereas the North was more suburban, more big cities, and more factories. As it says here, the North's economy focused more on finance and manufacturing, where the South focused more on more on agriculture, and the South, focusing more on the agriculture, needed more manual labor. Hence, the South having largely more slaves. Um, we'll skip to the next slide. We talk about the abolitionist movement. The abolitionists, again, the word abolitionist right here means to abolish, to get rid of. And in this case, it's to get rid of slavery. The abolitionist movement, very active in the North, and like it says in the Western states leading up to the Civil War. We talked about right here, this is Harriet Beecher Stowe and her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was one of the big reasons, one of the ways the North becomes informed on the harshness of slavery in the South. What you got to remember is in the late 1850s, just before the Civil War starts, that you don't have widely circulated. You don't have a lot of newspapers. You don't have radio. You don't have TV. You obviously don't have social media. Uh, so the only way these people are getting their information is from books, and the occasional newspaper. Um, so when Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, comes out, and you're from the North and you know nothing about slavery, the Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to shape your view on slavery, and it gives a very harsh view. So it really increased the opposition of slavery from the northern states. Um, as it talks about in here, African American slaves said it should have the freedom of their owners. Like it said, many but not all abolitionists believe African American slaves should have the freedom of their owners. Southern states opposed the abolition of slavery because they said they needed it to keep their farms operating. It was a financial necessity. The South depended on that slave labor. So, between the North and the South, you had these huge differences. The North had larger population, as it says here, and then most countries recognize the Union as being the primary government in being America. So when it was separated, the United States was the Union states. Like it said here, Britain and France had friendly relations with the South as the war started, and actually considered aiding the South. And the reason they had these friendly relations is because the Cotton Kingdom of the South provided all this raw material for Great Britain and France to manufacture many, many different things out of cotton, not limited to clothing. As it says here, the South had about 9 million people, but a third of those people were slaves. The average Southerner, like it says, was not as wealthy as the average Northerner in the North. So the average Southern person did not own slaves. it was only that top 5 to 10% of people in the South that owned slaves. Um, although, um, although even people that didn't own slaves supported the Confederacy. Um, Next, it says 90% of American industry and railroads were in the North. Reliance on slave labor discouraged the creation of new jobs in the South. So most immigrants, like it said, because there was not many jobs in the South, settled in the northern states. So they are gaining much more population than southern states. And two leaders. So when the South split, when it seceded or chose not to be part of the United States anymore, you had two different leaders. Each side had a president. The leader of the Union side was Abraham Lincoln. We know Abraham Lincoln is, like I have talked about many times, either the most famous or considered the best president in the history of the United States, or definitely in the top three, because he won the Civil War. What you got to remember, though, is until that war was won, he wasn't as near as popular. And then on the southern side, you had a man by the name of Jefferson Davis, which you learn through your cards. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederate States. Um, like it says, he was an officer in the war during the Mexican American War, and he had served as the United States Secretary of War. And it shows here when the South surrendered, he was charged with treason and prohibited from running for office again. The unique thing about that right there is typically if somebody was charged for treason, they were put to death. It was a no. It was an automatic death sentence for them, because of Abraham Lincoln's views. Abraham Lincoln did not want to punish the South for seceding. Abraham Lincoln wanted to join them and make them part of the Union again, even though they had fought a war against the North. So even though Jefferson Davis was charged with treason because the South loses the war, he was never punished over that. He could just never run for office again. You had many different generals on each side during the Civil War. The two main generals, the Union general Ulysses S. Grant, he was like we talked about before, the final general. He succeeded a guy by the name of George B. McClellan in being the commander of all Union forces throughout, all Union forces. And then you had Robert E. Lee, who was actually on the southern side, who was asked first to fight to be the head of the Union Army. He refused because he was from the state of Virginia, which was a Confederate state, and he was loyal to his state over his country. So the big argument of fighting for states' rights, he kind of reinforced that. Other generals on this list, you have George Meade, and then you have a guy on the Union side by the name of William T. Sherman, or William Tecumseh Sherman. And William T. Sherman was the general, the head of an army that essentially ended the war. What he did is he made his famous march to Atlanta, or march to the sea, and he did something called total warfare. Basically, what he did is he marched his army from the Union all the way through the Confederacy, and because the Confederacy at the time in 1864 was on its last legs, it wasn't what it was in 2 years before. He cut a path of destruction, basically destroying anything anything he came upon. That, not saying he killed women and children and so on and so forth, but he burned crops, killed livestock. So the South, they didn't have anything to fall back on. It was the equivalent to the World War II atomic bomb. He wanted to destroy the South so that they could not fight any longer. Over here on this side, you have a guy by the name of Thomas Jackson, or Stonewall Jackson as he was known. Now, he was killed early in the war, and many say that if he wasn't killed, that he would have, almost turned the tide of the war. He was such an effective general for the South. He was such a good fighter. But it said once he was killed, he was actually shot by one of his own men. That the war on the southern side, the leadership became much weaker. Then you have rounding out here, you have George Meade, you have James Longstreet, who fought in several important battles, and E.B. Stuart, who also fought on the side of the Confederacy in many important battles. So you had two different strategies. The North had a strategy of the Anaconda Plan. Winfield Scott was a very famous general that fought in the Mexican-American War also. And they had a plan called the Anaconda Plan. And so what he would do is he would cut off all southern resources. As you can see right here, they're going to cut off any outside help from England or France or really any other country, and they're slowly going to squeeze the South into submission, and that's where you get the name the Anaconda Plan. And then on the southern side, you had something called King Cotton. So what the Southerners did is they figured that they could basically defend their homeland long enough to make the North quit. So almost the same strategy that the colonies used during the Civil War or during the Revolutionary War to turn the war against the North, basically saying having people say it wasn't worth it, and finally just giving up the territory to the southern states. We've went over a little bit of the weaponry. Here's your this is an artillery projectile shot out of a cannon or a mortar. This was very similar to the mini ball that we went over. Because it was shot out of a cannon at a much wider range. Now, here's something that was new during the Civil War. You had something called canister shot. And what canister shot was, it was essentially a giant shotgun shell that you loaded into a cannon, and basically once it was shot, you had lead balls that came out, and they were very, very devastating to whoever they hit. Here's a mini ball. As you can see, it's on here. It's the Minié ball, which was a French invention, and in Americans obviously they turned it into an American saying, the mini ball. So we've already talked about that. So then two different rifles used in the Civil War. You have the Enfield. Enfield is still a British rifle company used. Throughout the both sides, American or Union and Confederacy. And then you have an American rifle here called the Springfield rifle. And as you can see, only the Union soldiers, unless captured, used Springfield rifles because they were manufactured in the North. And you can see right here, a new technology used during the Civil War was rifling. Any of you deer hunters out there, your rifles that you use also have rifling, which cause the bullet to spin at a very rapid rate. Very similar to a football being thrown. Uniforms, you had the gray Southern and the blue Northern. This is true for most of the war, although not everybody always wore those colors. And these colors were worn, if you remember, they talked about like open warfare. People just line up and would shoot each other. So having different color uniforms was very important, so you knew who you were shooting at. So major battles of the Civil War. Your first battle wasn't necessarily a major battle. It was Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was attacked a couple different times. Right here it says April 12th, 1861. It was also attacked by Union soldiers in December of 1860. This Fort Sumter was the start of the Civil War. It's in South Carolina, and your very first battle was Union soldiers assaulting Fort Sumter, taking it over, and then eventually the Confederate States take it back shortly afterwards. So your very first, the start of the Civil War was Fort Sumter. Your very first battle, talked about battle, major battle in the Revolutionary or in the Civil War was the first battle of Bull Run. Here it says Battle of Bull Run, and then it has Manassas. Well, the Union soldiers named their battles for landmarks. Bull Run was a creek, waterway that ran where they fought, and then Manassas was the name of the town. The South would always use the name of the town, so it was in Manassas, Virginia, or by Bull Run Creek in Virginia. This was the very first battle. It wasn't a very big battle, but it was the first major battle. We talked about earlier that people would come down from Washington, D.C., much like you guys would watch football on a Sunday afternoon. They went and watched this battle. And what ended up happening in the first Battle of Bull Run is the Southern soldiers routed the North, and these people ended up scrambling back to Washington, D.C. Couple things that the battle showed. One, that the South wasn't going to give up very easily. And two, the North had a lot of work to do. So your first battle that involved tens of thousands of troops was called the Battle of Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh was named for the landmark. The Battle of Shiloh was a church, and in Tennessee, so you hence get the Battle of Shiloh. It was an offensive battle by the Union. Shiloh, the North engaged the South, and even though it was like it says here that the North really was beaten back right away, there was just a ton of loss as far as casualties in this battle. It was a longer battle, and eventually what ended up happening is both sides suffered very heavy casualties, and the Union soldiers ended up making the Southern soldiers retreat further into Tennessee. So as you can see by the picture, the recreation here, it was a very, very extensive battle. So again, Shiloh was the Union name for the battle, and Corinth right here was the name what the South called the battle. A little bit on the war at sea. I'm not going to get into it too much. You had the famous ironclad ships, as you can see here. It was never really a battle at sea. It was more a battle in the different rivers in the North and the South. The most famous being the Monitor and the Merrimack. And what was funny about this battle is both sides had ironclad ships like this one, and the technology, the weaponry technology wasn't quite caught up with the armor technology. So basically what these two ships did is they ended up shooting at each other for almost 2 days, and not one of the bullets penetrated any of the armor. They just ended up bouncing cannonballs off of each other. So I'm sure in the boat it got really, really loud, but no damage was really done to either ship. So there wasn't a lot of naval battles simply because the technology to have big ships just wasn't there yet. It wasn't there until about World War I. The bloodiest battle of the Civil War was Antietam, or as it says here, the Battle of Sharpsburg. Sharpsburg was the town. Antietam was just the landscape that the North fought on. It was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. You can see the two generals. General George McClellan at the time was the head of all Union forces, and then we'll go back, and and Robert E. Lee was the commander for the South. The Federal Army, like it says, the Federal Army being the Union Army, beat up on the Confederacy. It went very back and forth, but eventually what happened was the Union pushed the Southern troops all the way back up the Antietam Creek, but But the biggest part of this was General George McClellan kind of wrote his own pink slip, his own firing notice, because he didn't pursue Lee into the South. And once the Union Army didn't pursue the Confederate Army into the South, it allowed the Confederate Army to rebuild, recoup, and come back at the Northern Army, and that was a big thing because it dragged the war on. Eventually, you get U.S. Grant, who actually pursues and chases the Confederate Army and eventually ends the war. Right here is an actual picture from Antietam. The Battle of Fredericksburg, I'm not going to go too far into the Battle of Fredericksburg, just another major battle in the war. And you can read right here as it talks about one unique fact here is you have a general on the Union side by the name of Ambrose Burnside. And Ambrose Burnside, if you noticed his name is Burnside. If you look up a picture of Ambrose Burnside, he has very large mutton chops. And later, what happened was it became much more northernized. You get the word sideburns from Ambrose Burnside. So what happened in the mix is they basically flipped his name around. He became known because he had the large mutton chops on his face, and you have sideburns, and it becomes a style of wearing your beard. The Emancipation Proclamation is something we've talked about. One thing we haven't talked about, it sets slaves free in Confederate states. There were slave states fighting for the Union. For example, Missouri was a Union state, but held slaves. It did not free slaves in those states. It freed slaves in the Confederate states only. So Abraham Lincoln, enticing those Confederate held slaves to run to freedom. The Battle of Vicksburg was your only major battle in the western states. Vicksburg was a siege, as you can see. It lasted from May 2nd to July 9th. And eventually, the Union general here, U.S. Grant, he ended up basically smoking the South out of the area of Vicksburg. And really what it did is it propelled Ulysses S. Grant to become the general of all Union forces. And then the Battle of Gettysburg, the turning point of the Civil War. The Battle of Gettysburg was, like I said, the largest battle, the biggest battle of the Civil War. It was an invasion of the North by Robert E. Lee, the only time that the South went on the offensive. Eventually the Union Army beats down and makes the Southern armies retreat. And it was another time that the Union Army didn't pursue the Southern Army and allowed the war to drag on for 2 more years because they did not pursue them and tried to destroy them in the southern states. The Gettysburg Address is historically probably the most famous American document ever written. What's real cool about it is Abraham Lincoln basically wrote the document while he was on the train from Washington, D.C. to Gettysburg to dedicate the Gettysburg Cemetery. This famous picture right here shows Lincoln delivering the Gettysburg Address. If you've never heard the Gettysburg Address, you can please listen to it. I think what we'll do is, we'll listen to the Gettysburg Address on Monday when I come back, because it is such a famous document, most famous document in American history, quite possibly. And as it says here, this most famous document, 272 words, which is not much. The speech was approximately 2 minutes long. And it's just the words that were said were pretty amazing. We talked a little bit about the Battle of the Wilderness, and talked about the hornet's nest within the wilderness. In the hornet's nest, in the Battle of the Wilderness, it was an area where some of the battle was fought. The life expectancy of a soldier in the hornet's nest was 7 seconds. Imagine that, 7 seconds. How amazing that is to even think of that stat. One of the last battles was Cold Harbor. It was really the last major battle of the Civil War. It was fought in Virginia, and as you can see, the Union suffered about 5,000, but it was the beginning of the end for the South. That all the reinforcements that the Confederacy had were being concentrated here, and it was a losing effort for the Confederacy. Like it says at the end here, the Grant-led army suffered 5,000 losses. It was heavy casualties, but Grant kept pursuing the Confederates into the South. He was chasing them, destroying their army, and this was very, very important. Sherman's March to the Sea, as I talked about before, please read through this. He declared total war. He destroyed everything in his path. He cut about 100-mile wide swath from the Union all the way down to Atlanta and all the way over to the sea through Georgia. And this was the Civil War equivalent to the atomic bomb. Your last major event of the war was the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on McLean's farm, which is shown here. And it was the ceasefire between the North and the South. There were battles fought afterwards, but they were because communication wasn't what it was today. The South gives up. They declare a ceasefire, and now the rebuilding starts. But you have one more major event, the assassination of President Lincoln. And as you can see, the South surrenders on April 9th. Lincoln is assassinated on the 14th of April, so just 5 days later. He had just been elected to his second term, assassinated by a guy by the name of John Wilkes Booth. Although there were more involved, John Wilkes Booth pulled the trigger with his Derringer 22 pistol, and the United States and the world lost probably the greatest president we have ever had. And because of his loss, many experts believe that the rebuilding of the Southern economy after the war was severely halted, meaning that it just didn't go how Lincoln envisioned it, because he envisioned it as the Union working with the South to make it better. And what ended up happening is many Northern people went south to help rebuild, but also to take advantage of the down and out Southern soldiers and the Southern economy. This talks a little bit about who else was involved in the conspiracy to kill Lincoln. It's a pretty interesting story. If you want to YouTube a video on Lincoln's conspirators, you can go for it during this time. Legacy of the war, as it talks right here, more than 600,000 Americans lost their lives. It was such a devastating war. Even though it's a war only in our history books now, if for anybody alive today, it's an event in the history books, but it really shaped our country and made it what it was today. It was a war to end slavery. It was a war to preserve what we believe in. It was a war to almost reinforce the Constitution, where if we don't believe what a government does, we have the right to rebel, regardless of the way we think about slavery and how wrong it was. It was a way to show. How powerful we can be if we are united. All right. So that's the end of the slideshow. Please watch the slideshow before you do anything else. And I will make another instructional video for you when I will make another instructional video giving you specifics on what you should do for an assignment on Thursday. All right, guys. Thank you. Have a good night. Oh,